I'm Alisa Anwar, and in this month's episode, we'll be looking at probably the greatest intergenerational problem that faces the young today: climate change. Now, the topic is hitting our headlines due to COP26. Having taken place in November 2021, COP saw over 100 world leaders join together for 2 weeks in Glasgow to make commitments towards the environment. But what if COP26 acknowledged the young?
What if?
What if?
What if?
What If? A monthly podcast series in partnership with IF, the Intergenerational Foundation.
As you know, we postponed COP26 by a year. But during that year, climate change did not take time off. And the IPCC report in August was a wake-up call for all of us. It made clear that the lights are flashing red on the climate dashboard. That report, agreed by 195 governments, makes clear that human activity is unequivocally the cause of global warming. And we know that the window to keep 1.5 degrees within reach is closing.
World leaders agreed to end deforestation by 2030. The Methane Pledge agreed to cut emissions of this greenhouse gas also by 2030. Everyone was encouraged to protect communities and natural habitats. Some states created plans to phase down their use of coal power, and countries agreed to keep 1.5 degrees alive. Seems promising on paper, but what about in practice?
Inside COP, there are just politicians and people in power pretending to take our future seriously, pretending to take the present seriously of the people who are being affected already today by the climate crisis. We say no more blah, blah, blah. No more exploitation of people and nature and the planet. No more exploitation. No more blah, blah, blah.
Those were the words of Greta Thunberg. Now, Greta's made a name for herself as one of the most widely known youth climate activists, and behind her is a growing brigade of young people concerned about their future. Climate change is probably the greatest intergenerational issue facing our young. 50% of the world's population are under 30, yet young people aren't given a platform at COP to voice their opinions. So what do the young think? I'm joined by 3 young activists, Paddy, Ishaan and Martin, to find out.
So Martin, we'll start with you as you were at COP26. Why do you think that young people are so passionate about climate change?
For us, it's always been an issue. And I think for us, we have a more of a vested interest in that it is very much so more our future, just by the very fact that we are younger. So any kind of things that we're doing now will directly affect our future and our children's future.
I think there's increasingly a sense that with all the wildfires last year, that the problem is now. It's no longer a problem in 2050. We're starting to really feel this already, and it's only going to get worse.
I think for the youth, for a lot of us over the last 20 years, perhaps, we've grown up in these times where we've seen abrupt weather patterns and climate crisis envelop our own kind of localities and our countries. There's an ecological breakdown happening quite vividly, and they're very upset about their present. Their present world does not give them that guarantee that they'll have a future to look forward to.
It was quite interesting because at the Youth for Climate event, and this was before COP26, Boris Johnson said, and I've got his quote here, "Young people around the world are already paying the price for the reckless actions of their elders." Now, all 3 of you have sort of said that, the burden of climate change does understandably fall upon us and future generations. Now, I think it is important that we don't play this generational blame game, but from your experience, do you think that there is that much worry or as much worry amongst the older generations for the climate as there is amongst young people?
Yeah, I think a lot of the older generations have been brought up in and profited from the industrial extractive capitalist world, right? That has given them huge upward mobility and that sense of development of their world. So for them, it's not as big a worry or something that is not as lived a reality.
I think there is a perception among our age group in particular that just some older generations just don't care. And I'm not sure that's entirely fair. I mean, for example, my grandparents' generation were brought up after the war, times were hard, and they were brought up to keep reusing things. Like, you darned your own socks, you did DIY. It was about minimizing waste. And we've moved away from that. But some of that generation still have those kinds of habits. And they weren't for climate reasons, but they still have concerns about avoiding waste and things like that.
There are also plenty of people younger people in our generation that couldn't give a toss about the climate and would be happy to do whatever, all sorts of things that we now know are harmful. But I also think that personally, a lot of the information I see about climate change is through things like social media, where obviously this generation is not so present. So I do think there is maybe not quite as much information that they access. It's not quite, climate change is obviously in the big media, but not quite so prevalent, and not you don't get all the kind of volume that you'll see going through Instagram or whatever.
I think one thing that kind of struck me at COP was that they didn't really provide any framework or strategy to include young people. So do you feel like the voice of the youth is listened to within discussions at a higher level on climate change?
Yes, so the week before COP, there was another conference, COP26, which was the kind of youth, it was affiliated with COP26 officially. So I think that was a great platform to have more young people come and give their views. I'm not 100% sure what was done with their views, but there was that. But no, there wasn't a huge amount of young people able to be in the actual conference, which is tricky. And it is tricky for young people to have an influence on policymakers, which is something that could massively be improved upon.
Yeah, I think the voices of the young at COP, it's interesting because I was there for 2 weeks, in fact, more than 2 weeks with different movements. And I did see there were platforms where people from different cultures and different age groups were invited, but I felt a lot of it was tokenistic.
Like, if you look at Alok Sharma's speech at the end of COP26 and listen to some of the people involved, they definitely heard the protests outside. And I think the youth voice was heard, but whether that translated into any kind of action in the political decision making, I'm not convinced that it really did. I think we can generalize about the youth as kind of one homogenous group. There's obviously young people in island nations which probably won't exist in 30 years, and they definitely were not listened to.
It's interesting because Greta and this youthquake that we've had in climate action is something that we really can't ignore, and that is youth-led. So do you think that that's translating into policy, or do you think, again, like Ishaan says, that it's very much tokenism? We acknowledge that Greta and this youth movement is there, but it's not really translating into anything.
I think it's definitely pushing for more action, pushing for more dialogue, and creating that sense of urgency. And I think that is a great first step. It still needs to translate more constructively and in a more kind of holistic way in how it shapes this collective policy. So, I mean, there's much to be done on that front, because essentially, Boris Johnson or a lot of the world leaders probably pick up what Greta might have said or the other youth leaders might have said, and kind of put that in their own speeches, but they do it, because it's popular. It's not because they really align with what they're demanding.
So what would you like to see happen?
Personally, I think it's not something that there can kind of be a one-size-fits-all answer to, across the world or even within different countries. I think one thing that's really important is a huge push towards really good, high-quality, interactive education that people can relate to, rather than just telling people that they need to take action, to help people understand why they should take action, understand the impact that their action can have. And then it will be I feel like there'll be much less friction between people doing things that will have an impact, whatever that may be, whether it's putting solar panels on your roof or going vegetarian. There's all sorts that people can do. And I think it's just helping people realize that and going ahead and doing that themselves, which obviously does take a lot of funding and is very complicated. But I think it is very, very possible. We've had huge public health messages. There's all sorts of words and acronyms that we now all know that you would not have known 18 months ago. So it clearly is possible. We just need to do it.
I completely agree. There's no like one size fits all. I mean, one of the ironies was that the same week that COP26 was starting, Biden was asking Saudi Arabia and Russia to boost oil production. And the thing is that we don't have the investment in the infrastructure needed to wean the economy off coal, but mainly oil in the Western world. And I think that needs to change. I think one of the important strategies we can do with that is the introduction of carbon taxes, which create some kind of disincentive on higher polluting foods and goods and things like that.
What we lack is the political will. And that political will can only emerge by having more diversity in these decision-making circles. It's really about listening and engaging with people from indigenous cultures who hold that ancient knowledge in understanding what is that is required for, reparations for our ecosystem. So I think it's through those kind of conversations and imaginations that we can really talk about cohesive climate action.
A lot of the time, targets aren't met, something which we may see with COP26. 2030 is a very convenient length of time for the goals. It's short enough to seem quite soon, but far enough that most of the current leaders that we have will have moved on. So only time will tell whether the promises made at COP will be kept. But is it just governments and international political bodies that have leverage in creating change? I'm now joined by Alice Bordini-Staden, who believes that the financial sector can help. Alice is an investment committee member and stewardship lead for the National Trust and is an advisory member of the Financial Reporting Council. So Alice, I'm interested specifically in how the financial sector can directly influence climate change and decarbonisation. Is it simply that the financial sector can put pressure on big corporations to reduce emissions? Or is it more than that?
Yeah, no, it's more than that. It's quite complex in which there are many different levers. So on one side, what we do as investors, we are having very robust conversations with the management and the board of these companies to encourage them to commit to a transition plan. Engagement is not just talking. Engagement has an escalation strategy that if the corporate is unresponsive, then we are ready to action. And perhaps the clearest example and most covered example in the news this year for investor action on climate has been essentially the rebellion at the ExxonMobil AGM, where led by a small fund, voted out 3 board members to replace them with 3 board members of our nomination that were more aware that times are changing. So that is what we do on the investor side. Then we have banks and insurance companies. They have an absolutely key role in the transition because they are the enablers. So if banks don't provide the financing and insurance companies don't insure the project is not going to happen. Now, of course, there is the role of public money. Public sector has a very, very important role because on one side, especially for poorer countries, this $100 billion a year that was promised in Paris and has yet to be delivered, that is money provided by developed countries and multilateral banks to help poorer countries to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change.
So essentially, as investors, you're having robust conversations with boards to be more climate aware in their decisions. You propose escalation plans. Banks then have an influence because they control the purse strings into what corporations can actually invest in. And then the public sector is there to de-risk these pro-climate initiatives. Is that a good summary, would you say?
By creating also the role of the public sector, the right set of policies, they can accelerate the transition. So, for example, when we see policy that says no internal combustion engine cars can be sold after 2030 or 2035, that gives clarity to automakers that they only have 13 years to sell internal combustion engine cars, after which, if they want to be in business, all of their sold cars are going to have to be electric. So creating this clarity on the direction of travel is essential for business so that business knows what's coming and they can prepare.
So essentially, investors, banks, and the public sector all need to be advocating this. But if one isn't, or we have some companies who aren't, or some governments who aren't, then surely that poses a massive challenge, because for this to work, everyone needs to be on board, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is absolutely true that if this is to happen in the required time frame to stay below 1.5 degrees, we need all parts of the economy to work, and we see clearly in Europe. In Europe is where we are most advanced in climate commitments, that on the finance side, we are leading policy. The problem is in other places. I'm afraid by China and India, Russia, Brazil, these large emitters are not aligned on 1.5 degrees. In fact, are deeply misaligned, and it's very true that if even if Europe halves its emissions by 2030 as committed, that doesn't help. That doesn't help in having a shared goal of 1.5 degrees. And once you have these large emitters that are still rolling out new coal, they are still increasing emissions, then it becomes very difficult for our overall effort to reach 1.5. Now, I am a big advocate of carbon pricing and a carbon tax to help our shared effort in keeping global temperature rises to acceptable levels.
As young people, we protest, we say that climate action needs to happen, and it's very much like government-led, our protests, whereas you've shown that the financial sector is so much more than that. Money really does control everything, and it is investors and it is banks and it's businesses that have so much power. It isn't just governments.
They all need to align and absolutely keep the pressure up around the financial sectors, around companies, around the producers of the goods that you buy from supermarkets to the takeaway places. So, for example, we saw it was very encouraging. I don't know if you remember, after Blue Planet 2 was released, and David Attenborough so well explained the plague of plastics in the ocean. And there's been a very, very marked shift in the UK consumers against plastics. Takeaway shops. So it was after this that Pret, for example, banned all plastic cutlery and introduced wood cutlery. And this is the power of the consumer. If the consumer says, I'm not going to go to Pret because they give me plastic cutlery, then Pret takes notice and they start introducing more environmentally friendly products. And that is the power of the consumer. So never underestimate what you young people can achieve by just shifting your buying choices. And I shouldn't leave this very interesting chat with you, Alisa, today without saying fast clothing is a real plague on the environment. So this notion that you can go and buy £5 t-shirts that you wear once or twice and then you throw them away. The clothing industry has got devastating effect on the climate and on biodiversity. This is also something that young people perhaps could be aware of and shift their actions on.
There's lots of little things that we can do that actually on a global scale make such a big difference as consumers.
Absolutely. The consumers, so their buying choices and their voting is so important. And Obama said it at COP last month. Don't think that politics is not for you. You're not interested in politics. Well, that is one of the biggest levers that you can have by voting the right people in power. So, we should all go and vote at the elections, because that is how we can change the direction of travel.
Money does really control the world, on a large-scale corporation level, but also on a small individual level. Alice shows that even as consumers, we can use our money and our vote to create change. So that's one way to help. Are there others? I'm joined by IF researcher John Hobby to tell us a little bit more about why he thinks degrowth might be the solution to climate change. And he also offers a positive look at the future.
If you want to talk about degrowth, I would say that quite a lot of people wouldn't really understand what that is.
Yeah. So as I said, like, it's not really about, aiming to reduce GDP, but it's kind of moving towards a growth agnosticism is what a lot of people call it. So it's kind of not really worrying about whether GDP as a whole is going up or down, but it's trying to focus on which parts of our economy sort of improve human welfare and don't degrade the environment. And trying to sort of scale those up, so that would be areas like public education, public healthcare, and the care economy. And then also realizing which parts of the economy are harmful for the environment and don't really improve human welfare. So like fossil fuels, excessive consumption, and all these kind of areas that sort of increase GDP, but don't really improve welfare and maybe harm the environment. And there are multiple ways to do that.
So you say there are multiple ways. Can you think of any examples off the top of your head?
So trying to incentivize companies to sort of make goods last for a longer amount of time, rather than sort of designing them to break. I mean, it sounds a bit conspiratorial, but designing them to break after 2 or 3 years, so that you need to replace them, maybe sort of moving towards products as services, so that there's more an incentive for companies to fix the goods that they've sold you rather than just replace them. And then sort of, when it comes to cars, people in big cities often don't always need a car. So maybe moving to sort of, renting cars. These are two policies that would lower GDP, but sort of wouldn't have a negative impact on human welfare. Sort of people would still be able to use these goods when they need them. But it would sort of make these sectors much less damaging for the environment.
Do you think that this was touched upon in COP at all, this idea of degrowth?
I personally don't really think so, especially not as part of the mainstream talks. I think that a lot of the solutions offered at COP were quite sort of path dependent. So they kind of, accept the way that we sort of produce and consume now and sort of aim to tweak them to produce, like less emissions, without really sort of fundamentally changing the way that we, the way that we do things, which for me is what's causing global warming and climate change. So I think cars are quite a good example of this. So there was a big push at COP26 towards the adoption of electric vehicles, which is definitely a good thing, because electric vehicles are much better than, sort of polluting petrol cars, but it's not going to solve all of our problems, right? So unless our national grid is 100% renewable, then, sort of that's still, electric cars still produce emissions. And also I think it's just kind of, it's a missed opportunity for us to redesign the way that our cities work. So I think degrowth is an important part of it because it's about recognizing the limits to GDP growth, and sort of how it can't be fully decoupled from resource use. But a lot of research shows that GDP can be completely decoupled from sort of carbon emissions, right? So I think the most important step has got to be the transition to renewable energy as quickly as possible. So here, I think that is something that's going to require massive government investment because at the moment it's too risky for the private sector to take on this transition. So what I think we need is a lot of public investment in green energy, to sort of crowd in private sector investment, to sort of do the basic research so that it's more profitable for the private sector to come in and sort of get on that wave of innovation essentially. I also think that investment and solidarity payments are going to need to be made to the global south and poorer countries, to help them decarbonize and also to sort of help them mitigate the impacts of global warming and climate change, which are going to, predominantly affect them. And then also I think sort of carbon markets as well are another policy that are quite important. So one of the big problems is that greenhouse gas emissions are sort of what economists call an externality. So it's not priced into the production of a good. So that's a cost that's borne by society and not by producers. So you need to find a way to price in the effect of carbon emissions. And carbon markets are one way of doing that. And it's good to see that in the EU, it looks like the emissions trading scheme is starting to take off. So that's a positive. So yeah, those for me are the most important sort of other solutions.
This whole topic of climate change and the whole topic of this podcast really can seem a little bit doom and gloom. So do you think that there is some hope? Do you think there's a light at the end of this tunnel, or do you think it's worrying?
I mean, it is worrying, but I think there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel. So one example that I sort of really gives me hope personally is sort of, it was a little bit before our time, but in the sort of 80s and 90s, the hole in the ozone layer was a big issue. And that sort of came about because of these chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons that were used as refrigerants. And in 1987, 196 countries got together in Montreal to ban the use of chlorofluorocarbons as refrigerants. The hole in the ozone layer started shrinking, and international cooperation and policy can have a big impact on environmental issues. I don't know, it shows that change is possible.
And I guess little things like the transition to veganism that quite a lot of people are doing, little things like not having plastic straws, like especially young activists and young people and social media is very much moving in the direction of we need to do X to solve the climate crisis. I think that wasn't there 20 years ago as much.
Yeah, and like as one individual, it seems like, you know, that doesn't really do too much, but grassroots movements towards different consumption patterns are really positive. And sort of even going back to COP, right? If countries follow their nationally determined contributions, forecasts are predicting a 2.4 degree rise above pre-industrial temperatures, which compared to before COP, you know, that figure was 2.7 degrees. So, you know, like it's a small difference, but it is a difference. Policy and grassroots movements together can hopefully save us. Fingers crossed.
They have to. There's no other option, is there?
There's no other option.
Unfortunately, there is too much short-term thinking. Governments are looking at resolving the next scandal, ensuring that they gain votes for the election, or even dealing with more imminent crises, like the current pandemic. Larger corporations are often money-motivated, looking to maximise their profits, but often cutting corners at the detriment of the planet. But it is quite easy to look at the big challenge of climate change and feel sad or worried about the future. COP26 is a step in the right direction, and if successful, it will provide an essential mechanism for creating intergenerational environmental fairness. And like the guests in this month's podcast have shown, everyone can do their own little bit. IF even have an easy-to-use template on their website for you to write to your MP to push for change, to ensure a better life for future generations. Fighting for equality amongst current and future generations is something that we should all strive towards and is central to the work of IF. If any of the topics and discussion in this month's podcast have caught your attention, then head over to www.if.org.uk, where IF have conducted incredible research into the topic, or follow the Intergenerational Foundation on Twitter, Facebook, and even Instagram. See you next month.
What if?
What if?
What if?
What If? A monthly podcast series in partnership with IF, the Intergenerational Foundation.